it.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to wait a couple of minutes to help everyone get on board before we start. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those joining us from around the world. And welcome to the Crisis, Response, and Recovery, Nature-Based Tourism, Biodiversity, and Livelihoods. My name is Kelly Bricker, and I'm a member of the Tapas Group and serve as the coordinator for the Capacity Building Work Group. My day job is professor and director of the Hainan Arizona State Tourism College, and I am thrilled to have worked alongside the Center for Responsible Travel, IUCN, the WCPA Tapas Group, and of course the World Wildlife Fund to make this event possible. I wanted to take a moment and thank each and every one of you for being here today. This past year and a half have offered us a new reality. And while we would love to be sitting face to face with you today, I feel pretty lucky that we're able to gather together in this virtual space. Throughout our first event and our second event happening in just a few hours from now, we'll have the opportunity to hear from 26 speakers from all across the world. And today we'll have 3 different sessions with panelists who are inspiring, engaging, and paving the pathway forward for nature-based tourism, biodiversity, and livelihoods. You'll have the opportunity to hear directly from these global experts and listen to their wisdom and experiences. During each of the sessions, you'll have a chance to hear from each speaker for about 10 minutes. And then we'll have 10 minutes or so for Q&A at the end of each session. After the event, we will be sharing follow-up resources and including answers to frequently asked questions that we may not get to during the session. In just a few minutes, we'll put some housekeeping instructions in the chat and some instructions as we move forward. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jim Sano from the World Wildlife Fund, who will be our facilitator for the first session, Biodiversity Conservation Financing through Sustainable Nature-Based Tourism. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you so much, Kelly. And again, my name is Jim Sano with the World Wildlife Fund. As you all know, the COVID-19 pandemic laid bare that nature-based tourism is the largest market-based contributor to finance and steward protected areas. It also underscored that the vast majority of enterprises are micro, small, and medium enterprises, companies that certainly lack the capital and the collateral to weather storms, certainly as large as this one, but also invest in biodiversity conservations going forward. In this session, we'll highlight the financing challenges and identify potential emerging solutions. And I'm honored to lead off this session to hear Dr. Urvashi Narain's thoughts, and she's the lead economist from the World Bank. So over to you, Urvashi.
Thank you very much, Jim. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. and to present and share with you findings from one of our latest reports on this issue called Banking on Protected Areas, Promoting Sustainable Protected Area Tourism to Benefit Local Communities. This work has been done in collaboration with the University of California at Davis, and I'd like to recognize their contribution, and my lead co-authors at the World Bank, Hasita Bhamar and Phoebe Spencer. So next slide, please. So why did we do this report? What were our objectives? First and foremost, we wanted to assess the economic impact of protected area tourism on local economies. Now, why did we do that? We find often that protected areas are seen as good for conservation, but are not seen as part of a country's development strategy. They're seen as something where you set aside land, but you no longer can use that for development. And we wanted to make the case that protected area and promoting sustainable and inclusive tourism in protected areas actually is good, not only for conservation, but it's also good for development. And so that was one of our key goals. We also, why did we focus on the local economy? We wanted to it's a goal for us in of itself, because for the World Bank, you know, our main our objectives are to help alleviate extreme poverty and to boost shared prosperity in a sustainable manner. And oftentimes some of the poorest communities live around protected areas. But also we know that unless communities around protected areas feel engaged and feel that they are participating in conservation, it is very hard for them to often to be partners, because you know, they bear some of the cost of conservations through wildlife conflict. And finally, we wanted to make the case that investing in protected areas is good economics. We wanted to talk to our finance ministers to show them that as part of their economic recovery strategies, they should be investing in protected areas and to promote sustainable protected area tourism. So with that objective, what did we do? Next slide, please. Our study was, we did the 4 detailed case studies in 2 focused on marine protected areas in Brazil and Fiji, and 2 on terrestrial protected areas in Nepal and Zambia. And this work was done in collaboration with local students, and you can see some of their photographs on the slide below. Next slide, please. And what was the methodology that we applied? We used something called the LUI, which is the Local Economy-Wide Impact Evaluation. It's a general equilibrium model that allows you to capture both the direct impact that a tourist has on the economy, whether that's through paying entrance fees or some of the participating in tourism-related activities, but also the indirect impacts that triggers, right? When tourism operators hire local community members, or when they source goods from local community members, that is an important indirect. But then that kind of, when wages are earned by these local community members, they in turn spend money in the local economy, and that triggers another round of spending. And this methodology allows us to systematically identify those mechanisms, but also to quantify them. So we applied this methodology, the LUI, in each of our model, in our case studies. And so what did we find? Next slide, please. I'll share with you some of the key findings today, but we have a lot more information in the study, and I'll share with you the link where you can get more information. So first and foremost, we found that protected area tourism is good for development and conservation. And how did we characterize good for development? We estimated the income multipliers, that $1 of additional or a unit of additional spending that the tourist brings to the local economy, what kind of additional impact does that trigger? And one way to estimate it, as you know, is through an income multiplier, which is defined as the change in household income per unit of money that is entering the local economy. So we found in, as shown in in this slide, that in almost every country, in every case study, the income multiplier was significantly greater than 1, showing that there are strong local market linkages. We also found we were able to estimate the number of jobs that can be attributed in the local economy, both through the direct and the indirect economic impact. And we found a significant number of jobs are created. And these are, of course, for hotel operators, for tour operators, but also jobs for, that to supply various goods and commodities and other services to the tourism sector. And so, for example, in the Mamanutha Islands in Fiji, we found that 13% of the local population is employed through the tourism sector, which is very significant. Next slide, please. We also found that benefits accrue widely and both to poor and relatively non-poor households. And in almost every case, we found that as a relative share, the poor households actually benefit more, as shown in this graph. And we also found that it's not just households who are directly involved in the tourism sector, but also households who have actually no direct connection with the tourism sector who are benefiting. Next slide, please. And we also have information on the cost that is incurred by communities. And in the interest of time, I'm not able to share that with you, but we did look at the cost of human-wildlife conflict and make the point that those who benefit may not be the ones who incur the costs, and there's a need for this kind of compensation mechanism to be put in place. We found, of course, that the return on government investment is at least 6 times the cost. So the amount of money that the government is investing, the return they get when estimated through the economic impact on the local economy is at least 6 times. This is, of course, an underestimate because the return accrues widely, not just in the local economy, but also beyond the local economy. Now, it's important to note that we see this very high rate of return in Zambia, in the South Luangwa National Park, for example, but that is also an indication of underinvestment, right? You have this very high return because it's severely underinvested. But broadly, the message for governments is that this is good investment. This is a good return on the money that's being invested. And so this is, a call to action to increase investment in protected areas, but also to promote the tourism, which will then bring these economic returns. Next slide, please. Turning next to our policy recommendations, and here again, in the interest of time, I will just briefly touch upon these. We bucket the policy recommendations in 3 broad categories. One is the need to protect the natural asset, because unless the asset is protected, you will not have tourists come at all, right? So that is very central to any work that is done in this sector. Then it is also, government also needs to grow and diversify the business. And finally, a bucket on their policies and institutions must be in place to make sure that these benefits are being shared with local communities and that this is not some form of enclave tourism. So in the,
1 minute.
What do I mean? And thank you for that. What do I mean in terms of protecting the natural asset? This is, of course, investing, but increasing the capacity of protected area managers. We also urge governments to do more regular, evaluations and sort of assessments such as ours in order to inform this. And growing and diversifying the business means enabling conditions for private sector to participate, but to make sure that it isn't just 1 or 2 protected areas where the tourism are coming and there's overcrowding. And finally, many different ways in which communities can benefit through benefit sharing or through employment or local sourcing of goods. And next slide, please. This is my last slide. So we also make the case that protected area tourism is a green economic recovery initiative, because what do governments look for in an economic recovery initiative? They want jobs created, they want income multipliers, and they want to make sure that the benefit is greater than the cost. And I hope I've convinced you through our report and through the findings that tourism, sustainable and inclusive tourism, does all of that. It generates jobs, it creates high income multipliers, and generates high return on public investments. So with that, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity. And if you could just move to the last slide, it just gives you the URL. I know more information will be shared, but this is the URL where you can find much more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rasi. I just want to remind everybody, as we hear our wonderful speakers, that please, if you have questions, put them in the chat box. Kelly will be collecting them, and after the end of this presentation, we'll be able to answer those questions. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gregory Miller, who is the Executive Director for the Center for Responsible Travel.
Great, and you can see my screen okay, everybody? Kim?
We see you.
Can you hear me?
On your screen.
Oh,
We see your lovely background, Greg.
weird. Okay, hold on. It said it was sharing, but figures I would do.
Greg, would you like me to share it for you?
Yes, go ahead. Seems to be. That's why we sent it to you, right? It does have some animations in it, so just click through them when I. Yeah, my apologies. I don't know why it's not sharing. I guess I should have practiced it this morning. That's weird.
All right, Greg, you should be good to go.
Can you see my slides now? Maddie?
Yep.
Okay, and everybody else. Okay, terrific. Next slide. And just click through all the top text on the first slide. Don't go to the second one. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Sorry about that, but we have backup. I'm going to be talking to you today about how in essence, the 30 by 30 challenge that has been set up by the United Nations and by conservation and natural resource managers globally to protect 30% of the lands and waters across the planet by 2030. Now, my good friend and hero, E.O. Wilson, who's down there with me on the lower left, he stated that addressing climate change and saving biodiversity is a communal endeavor with a clear, definable goal that humanity is faced with, and that we need to get this kind of cooperation looking at protected areas, nature-based tourism, et cetera, to really lead the charge for a sustainable future. And to limit this loss, the United Nations has urged countries to commit to conserving 30% of their lands and water, almost double the area currently under some form of protection now. This plan additionally calls on the world to strengthen conservation on all remaining areas to stem biodiversity loss, preserve ecosystem services, et cetera. Next slide. And if you could bring everything up again. Maddie, sorry about that. Without question, the science is clear. Conserving and restoring 30% of lands, waters, and oceans worldwide is the bare minimum that we need. It's also a unique opportunity to support community-led conservation efforts and engage with those on the front lines. In the United States, my colleagues that will be speaking after me, Sue and Derek, will be doing a deep dive of issues in Africa. So let me talk about what happened with the Biden administration being elected. And this is some direct language that came from at that time, the new Biden administration, that Democrats will protect wildlife, habitats, and biodiversity, slow extinction rates, and grow America's natural carbon sinks by conserving 30% of our lands and waters. And another way it was worded, and this is what President Biden said in Glasgow, protecting biodiversity, slowing extinction rates, and helping leverage natural climate solutions is paramount for the US. The challenge is great in the United States because 12% of land and 26% of waters are protected, but there is a heck of a lot of land and water. that is not protected. In fact, 80% of the highest biodiversity hotspots in the United States, which those of you who study this know that the US itself is a biodiversity hotspot, has actually several, are not currently protected. Next slide, please. And again, bring them all. Yeah, thank you. Speakers throughout our conference today and tonight will talk about the potential and the pitfalls. Let me just, I won't focus on this particularly, rather that the pitfalls of nature-based tourism need to be taken into account. The negative impacts of tourism are without question real, whether it's climate change, impacts on wildlife, etc. So what I want to do with the remaining time is zero in on how this 30 by 30 challenge sets in motion, I think, an extraordinary synergy between nature-based tourism, protected area management, and biodiversity conservation and climate change adaptation. Next slide, please. Thank you. Urvashi presented some very interesting information just now from the World Bank study, and I want to reference a new study that came out from one of our colleagues, published in 2021 by Waldron et al. And this is looking at the costs and benefits of extending the world's marine and terrestrial protected areas to at least 30%, the 30 by 30 target. And in this study, which was global, they found, Waldron and that team found that the economic and financial benefits of the significant extension to 30% outweighs the costs by a factor of 5 to 1. Urvashi just reported out with her studies 6 to 1. So this is again a significant multiplier, and this ratio is primarily driven, and this is what I think is significant for us today, by the growth in nature-based tourism. It far outweighs the economic impacts of agriculture, timber, and fisheries. And in fact, the recovery from the pandemic, the nature sector of tourism is projected to grow 4 to 6% per year, compared to less than 1% for agriculture, timber, and fisheries. That is a significant difference in looking at nature-based tourism and experience-based economy with more of an extraction-based agriculture, timber, and fisheries. Maddie, next slide, please. And again, bring it up. Thank you. Yeah, when tourism, and we've seen during the pandemic, when tourism stops, the benefits of conservation certainly slows, or in fact stops. We've seen through the pandemic, the lessons of vulnerability show that without question, and many of our speakers this morning and tonight will talk about this, there has been an over-reliance of nature-based economies in biodiversity-rich countries on rather unsustainable forms of tourism. Tourism that doesn't have the kind of design, operation, and marketing of nature-based tourism that we need. And in fact, with COVID protocols now, we are seeing a pushback that is actually requiring the sector to adjust in order to continue providing the add-on services of conservation of nature. And what we see from the pandemic on nature-based tourism globally and locally is it emphasizes the urgency of us diversifying our tourism products, operations, community livelihoods, and conservation funding beyond a sole reliance on the traditional business models of tourism. Next slide, Matt. So this will be reinforced by many of my colleagues in our symposium, but the right type of nature-based tourism done in a sustainable way is a powerful conservation tool. That is, I believe, borne out by all the research. Creates jobs for the local community, builds a nature-based tourism sector. The governments that develop partnerships with private, community, indigenous, and nonprofit organizations are in a better position to realize the full capacity of nature-based tourism. And private investment and know-how are needed, and private land conservation is a key element to that. And good public management, we have, without question, must ensure that there are equitable business practices and reinvestment of profits into the conservation of wildlife. So when we look at the 30 by 30 challenge and nature-based tourism, ultimately, this forum, when done right, will grow the economy, protect nature, and support human development. Next slide, please. And bring them all back. Thank you. Okay, so let's take a look and really let's think through. And I ask all of you to think about throughout the talks that we have through our first and second events of this, that looking strategically at the 30 by 30 challenge and thinking about how we want to more sustainably develop and implement nature-based tourism. There's a number of things that I think are a tremendous possibility for us that I'd like us all to consider as we move forward on our journey. First is that social and economic benefits of nature-based tourism actually, we believe, will encourage the designation of additional protected areas and the enlargement or improvement management of existing ones. Remember, in the context of the United States, what I reported out just a couple of minutes ago, 80% of the biodiversity hotspots in the United States are not in any area of protection. Second, bringing nature-based tourism and the 30 by 30 is to improve the permanent financial stability of existing and new protected areas. And this is critical both for climate change and for biodiversity conservation, no question. Third is that we want to implement binding, and I want to emphasize that, protocols for nature-based tourism, better standards and protocols in and around protected areas, ensuring that we see an actual increased sustainability of all related activities and operations in order to achieve genuine forms of conservation supporting tourism. And finally, and I will leave this point with everyone, whether you're a nonprofit or a government agency rep, is that for governments, it is critical that we look at, push forward and achieve that governments work to create national tourism plans for protected areas, and they integrate them into the economic plans of the country. Next slide.
Greg.
Next slide. So I think with that, I think we have a tremendous opportunity to bring our practitioners and thought leaders together in our symposium here, and I appreciate your attention and look forward to learning a great deal from my colleagues. So thank you. Back to you, Jim.
Thank you so much, Gregory. And next we have Dr. Sue Snyman, the Research Director for the School of Wildlife Conservation at the African Leadership University. Over to you, Sue.
Thanks very much, Jim, and thank you for the opportunity. I apologize for the background noise, but there is a massive thunderstorm in Johannesburg at the moment, and it's thundering and pouring with rain. So I apologize if there is some noise. So I'm going to be talking to the wildlife economy in Africa and the importance of tourism. And interestingly, from Mavashi and Gregory's presentations, a lot of what I'm going to present ties very closely and supportive of what they have been saying. So before moving on, I just wanted to define the wildlife economy as we are defining it at the African Leadership University, so that we are all on the same page in terms of what I'm meaning by it. So the wildlife economy uses indigenous wildlife, both plants and animals, including marine and terrestrial, as an economic asset to create value that aligns with conservation objectives, but also delivers sustainable growth and economic development. So very much in line with what Gregory was explaining, that they are not mutually exclusive, and Avashi also alluded to it. And it's about plants and animals, fauna and flora, but very much the activities within the wildlife economy, as we are looking at them, have to align with conservation objectives and have development impacts. And just in terms of the importance of the wildlife economy, is the recognition of wildlife as a key strategic asset. Currently, in most countries, and especially in Africa, wildlife is often just seen as a resource, not as an asset. And it is a key growth opportunity for Africa, the wildlife economy, because there's already a comparative advantage in Africa, because a lot of livelihoods already depend on the wildlife economy, a lot of economic activities, broader macroeconomic activities. And the ability of the wildlife economy, if wildlife is seen as a key strategic asset, to encourage more public and private investment into landscapes to improve conservation and support economic development, is huge. But we do need this enabling environment, and Vashi also talked about that, for unlocking this potential. If this is done, if wildlife is seen as a key strategic asset, and there's investment in it, and then the enabling environment is there, countries will improve local livelihoods, they'll increase fiscal revenues, promote job creation, and promote conservation. So it really is a win-win. Just in terms of the potential of the wildlife economy, essentially the stock of the wildlife is the stock. So you have the fauna and the flora, and that is the stock. And then the wildlife economy are the activities which utilize that stock. So essentially the flow. So ecotourism is the largest one in most African countries, the largest wildlife economy activity and the most well-known. Then forest products is also a larger one and utilized mostly for livelihoods and subsistence. Then you've got hunting, specifically in Southern Africa, quite large. And then other options include wildlife ranching, wildlife estates, which is smaller, and film and photography, which is very small in Africa and needs to grow. And then the carbon space, which is currently quite small, but has a lot of untapped potential. And then you have this big yellow circle of untapped potential, which can essentially be distributed across all the other circles, but also there are new and innovative and creative ways we can do this. And what is critical in all of this is diversification. And it's key to building resilience and sustainability. So making sure that we don't have all our eggs in one basket. And Gregory mentioned that, especially this, over-reliance on nature-based tourism. But it is still a key part of the wildlife economy. So at African Leadership University, we recently published a report on the state of the wildlife economy in Africa, which you can download on the School of Wildlife Conservation website, where we looked at ecotourism, hunting, ranching, carbon, and forest products across Africa, but then specific case studies on Ghana, Gabon, Kenya, Rwanda, and South Africa. And then since the publication of the report, we published a case study on Tanzania, and we'll be publishing one on Uganda shortly. And the aim is to do one for each country and outlining all the different activities and the value that they represent in those countries and the potential and how to unlock it. So the importance of ecotourism in Africa. So multipliers and value chains are, they're standard important benefits from ecotourism. But in Africa specifically, some of the benefits, employment, often in rural areas where there are few alternative opportunities are available, is really a key benefit of ecotourism, as is the skills training and development in these areas where there often isn't any available. Then the infrastructure related to the ecotourism, so the roads, the communication, and the access to markets, which this opens up. And then conservation communities and governments receiving revenues. And COVID obviously hugely highlighted this reliance on tourism for that in terms of lease fees, concession fees, and contributions through philanthropy and through projects in communities and conservation. So really ecotourism is critically important in Africa. Just some quick facts. These actually cover mostly tourism, because in the research that we've done, the data on ecotourism specifically is very sparse, and quite a lot of it is just site level. There isn't a lot of national data, and that needs to change if we really want to show the impact and the value. So overall in 2019, travel and tourism in Africa contributed 7.1%, as well as for 24.6 million jobs. Tourism in Africa is mostly leisure driven. A lot of that is visiting family and friends, but a lot of it is also related to protected areas, where wildlife is often what initially attracts, especially international tourists, but also regional tourists. And before the COVID-19 pandemic, Africa's tourism industry was growing faster than the economy as a whole. And interestingly, a study showed that the wildlife industry in Africa, and by the UNWTO, was the direct value was 12.4 billion and indirect, total, including indirect and induced, 42.9 billion. So really essential to driving economies in Africa. And then I just want to mention a specific case study, or a sort of a landscape level illustration of how the tourism is benefiting conservation and employment and revenues. So in the Greater Kruger National Park, a study by Chidikel et al. In 2020, the research was done in 2017, but in the Greater Kruger, which includes the Kruger National Park, a parastatal, plus private reserves and provincial reserves, there were 3.5 million visitor nights in that time, with 35% being foreign. So you can see a big domestic market, and 82.2% were visiting the core area of the Kruger National Park, which was so important to attract visitors to around there. And the Greater Kruger National Park contributed approximately 495 million to the national economy through supply chain multipliers. And for every direct job in the Greater Kruger, another 1.43 jobs were sustained locally. So very much building on Uvashi's presentation and the impact of those multipliers. And so this is just one landscape in South Africa where the impact of the protected area and the tourism related to that is having national economic benefits. Then at the African Leadership University, we are busy working on a wildlife economy investment ranking, which essentially will look at countries across Africa, but specifically on a few to start as a pilot, but looking at the wildlife asset base. What is the wildlife asset base? How are those resources being managed? What is the governance structures? Is there an enabling environment, and is it easy to do business? And then ranking countries on that to really encourage countries to make it easy to do business, to create that environment and to encourage investment so that we can unlock the wildlife economy. And then just for those who are interested, we've recently published a roadmap for Africa's wildlife economy, which can be used in other contexts, not just Africa focused. It outlines 5 steps for unlocking the wildlife economy, and it's available in English, French, and Portuguese. And then we also have a wildlife economy resource database, and we would welcome any publications to be added to that. This database was built by an ALU student from scratch, and you can search by country, by topic, by year, by author, and we hope to just keep that updated at all times. Then just to end off with a few key takeaways, cross-sectoral collaboration is important, the breaking down of silos, especially in the tourism sector, because you have the environment, the water, tourism, customs, immigration, all involved, but not talking to each other. So that cross-sectoral collaboration is critical. Government support for an investment in wildlife and tourism, given the economic benefits that it's providing, is crucial. So moving from that seeing this as a resource to an asset. Diversification of and within all wildlife economy activities is important to reduce risk and build resilience. So that is, using the activities we already have and diversifying within them, but also including other activities. Then monitoring and evaluation is important, including robust regular data collection, to allow for data-driven decision-making going forward. This is critical, especially as countries revise policies and practice post-COVID. And we have been working with the European Commission Biopalma project on the global database of protected area visitation, which you'll hear about in one of the other sessions. And the lack of data is really outstanding, specifically for Africa. And so how do you manage if you're not measuring it? And then finally, tourism is not a panacea, but it has a key and critical role to play as part of a diversified wildlife economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue, for your excellent perspective. And lastly, we have a voice from the private sector. Derek. Over to you, Derek.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you for the invitation to speak to this seminar. And very interesting to be the last of 4 speakers and seeing common themes to what I'm going to talk through coming from all of the previous presenters. And I hope that we'll see what those links are. So I'm going to talk to the safari industry impact model. And I like to think of it as being best represented by a seesaw, such as you would find in a child's playground, where the foundations for that whole model is the large sums of money that are paid in the first instances for the use of the land that the industry operates on in the form of leases, royalties, park entry, however it's structured, the significant amounts paid in salaries and wages for staff employed by the industry, and the contribution to local economies made by purchases of goods and services. Collectively, these all support local economies, but also contribute towards the ongoing maintenance and protection of the protected areas, and hopefully also prevents changes in land use from occurring. Now, obviously, the model is balanced by, on the one hand, the positive impacts that arise from the industry and the potential negative impacts, those being the pitfalls that Greg talked about earlier on. And there's also the carbon balance for the industry, which itself is a blend of, on the one hand, the land under wildlife and carbon storage, and on the other hand, any carbon emissions that are arising from the business. And obviously the objective here is to tilt that, that seesaw by firstly minimizing the negative impacts that are arising, and secondly, maximizing the positive impacts. We also want to see the carbon balance moved in a constructive direction by, on the one hand, increasing the land that's under wildlife and carbon storage, and on the other hand, minimizing any carbon emissions from the business that are arising. We quite often asked what the impacts from the industry are worth. It's a difficult question to answer because there's a lot of intangible and in-kind contributions being made. But a couple of years ago, about a year before COVID hit, the organization that I work for did a bit of an exercise to try and quantify this. And we reached the conclusion that between the contributions that the business was making directly itself and the contributions that we were mobilizing from our guests and our partner, primarily non-governmental organizations, we were contributing the equivalent of 12% of our revenue, or we were mobilizing, should I say, the equivalent of 12% of all revenue generated towards conservation or development initiatives in the areas in which we operate and the countries. And what's quite useful to note is that that figure is more than 3 times the value that was distributed to the shareholders of the business. So a very significant contribution. Some people ask, why would a safari operator want to make these interventions? Firstly, there are a number of factors that compel operators to make them simply as good corporate citizens, because local regulations and legislation require it, or because guests and agents expect it. But I think it's much more important to look at the reasons why it's in the operator's best interest to do so. Firstly, and most importantly, the health of ecosystems in Africa, and therefore the health of any businesses that are based on those ecosystems, is dependent upon the goodwill of surrounding communities, and securing this goodwill requires the fair and equitable engagement of these communities. Secondly, any negative impacts on ecosystems resulting from the industry's operations will ultimately harm the business. And conversely, any improvements to ecosystems and species populations will be to the benefit of the business. Finally, because we find that making these positive contributions and interventions is a precondition to hiring and retaining the best and the brightest staff. And so our view is that this is simply enlightened self-interest. So what have been the consequences of COVID? I mean, I think we all know that COVID has been catastrophic for the tourism industry. In the parts of the world in which we operate, occupancies and revenues in 2020 were of the order of 5% of those in the prior year. And although things have been a little better this year, we're still talking about well below 30% of what was achieved in 2019. And that outcome very much dependent upon the rollout of vaccines. The consequences of this have been, as people have talked about, many staff retrenched or furloughed for quite long periods of time now. The disappearance of large parts of the flow of purchases of goods and services, and possibly the disappearance of some elements of local supply chains. We've seen operators struggling to meet their lease commitments, and certainly any variable element to those lease commitments shrunk to almost zero, with consequent reductions in revenues to protected areas and communities, collapses in tax revenues from the industry and related business, and finally, a risk of failure of tourism businesses as well. But I think it's very important that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Does these difficulties mean that the tourism model has failed, as is being suggested in some forums? And I'm very skeptical about that. Firstly, the industry has been operating in its present form for nearly 40 years now, making this contribution to economies, conservation, and communities And this is the first time in that period that we've seen such serious disruptions. I'm also skeptical about what the alternatives are. But clearly, if they are there, if they do exist, and they are practical and timely, why haven't they been exploited? Having said that, if they are there and they do exist, they should be exploited to achieve the resilience that Sue Sneyman talked about. But I think it's important that we don't waste time, effort, and resources on what might ultimately prove to be futile exercises. So we need to make sure that the focus is right here. Clearly, in this situation, the priority is to get tourism back on its feet. Aside from surviving the pandemic, the industry faces a number of challenges, amongst them being retraining of staff who haven't worked for 18 months or more, the need to escalate maintenance that perhaps has been neglected or was unaffordable while the business was not operating, the need to raise working capital for supplies and purchases so that camps and other accommodation facilities have the supplies that they need to operate. And lastly, and perhaps most difficultly, how to handle any debt or arrears that have accumulated as a result of trying to survive the last 18 months. From the industry's perspective, one of the disappointments has been that the development community has not been able to assist. I know there are a few exceptions in some countries, but largely the development community hasn't been able to assist, not even by assuming some of the industry's commitments to protected areas and or communities. And obviously, the sooner the industry is back to full steam, the sooner it can resume making its previous contributions. Clearly, vaccinations and the removal of travel restrictions are key to achieving this, and it's very good to see that the last few months have seen some improvements in that regard. And finally, I would just like to reiterate the point that Sue made, which is that conservation tourism is not the solution everywhere. There are many important wild parts of Africa that need conservation, need investment, but that aren't suitable for this model. And clearly in those places, other funding models will be required. So thank you very much. That's all I've got to say for the time being. I look forward to the question time, and I very much enjoyed following my 4 previous presenters.
Thank you so much, Derek, for your practical, on the ground, in the field perspective. Really appreciate it. And now we'll turn it over to Kelly for questions in it.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you to all our speakers for this incredible panel on insights into biodiversity, conservation, and financing through tourism. So we have quite a few questions, so I think we'll hit those straight away. I'm going to start off with a comment and just ask maybe some of you to reflect on this, or perhaps Greg, you might have a comment on this. The comment is, please do not forget that the 30 by 30 target has not been adopted by many Indigenous peoples and local communities who have many issues, and these are still under debate. So any comments, Greg?
Yeah, I can take a quick stab at that and then open it up for my colleagues. I should have mentioned that, and it's a great question and comment. Right now, there's been tremendous focus on 30 by 30 on existing protected area categories with inadequate outreach for both indigenous or tribal properties, lands, historic or spiritual lands, as well as the all-important private landscape. I think we've got 2 very important elements here for very different reasons that we need to look at, and the tourism industry is working with both of those, whether it's through indigenous tourism and the desire that native populations, tribal groups wish to capitalize on, and also private land operators, whether it's in Africa with private reserves, obviously well organized, or the tremendous private lands that you see in some parts of the Americas, for example. So there's much work to be done, and in order to achieve 30 by 30, we need to look at and make the tent far bigger in terms of being more inclusive and getting those voices. And there is, I think Derek said this, there is no one size fits all in this, and there's no one formula or prescription. So let me leave it at that.
Thank you, Greg. Does any other panelist have any comment on that? Okay, I think we'll move to the next question then. The question starts with, great to see some measures of protected areas, economic returns to local communities. However, with tourism and recreation now being listed as a conservation threat for more than 8,000 species on the IUCN Red List, how do we square the round peg of meeting protected area conservation targets and trying to maximize economic returns through tourism? A big question. Derek, do you have some comments you'd like to start us off with?
Yeah, it's simply a question of how is the model implemented and run, and that's a process. That's a process that requires pre-assessment before development occurs, so that the nature of any development that occurs is appropriate to the destination, to the underlying resources, and most importantly, that the numbers of tourists that are going to be moved through these areas is sustainable in the context of that destination. And there are, I mean, we well know that there are many instances around the world and in Africa where numbers of tourists being moved through destinations are excessive, and therefore resulting in the negative impacts that I talked about in my presentation, the pitfalls that Greg talked about in his, and it's a question of the pre-planning and monitoring to make sure that those don't arise, and that the seesaw is tilted in the correct direction.
Thank you.
Kelly, can I, sorry,
Yeah.
no, Vashi, do you want to go first,
No.
Vashi?
Oh,
Okay, yeah, I'll be short. Just to add to what Derek said, I think there is a need to both, not every protected area is suitable for tourism, right? But I think what's important to recognize also is that the revenue that you generate through nature-based tourism then supports these other protected areas as well. So I think that has to be kept in. So some areas also maybe where we should not promote tourism because of the threat to wildlife, right? So there is, as Derek said, it's really how you implement this. And then just to add that, communities bear the brunt of some of the human-wildlife conflict, right? And the more that we improve the models whereby communities can benefit, you will also see more support for conservation. So just to add to that, over to Sue.
Thanks. I very much in line with what you said, Vashi, is utilizing the tourism funds for conservation. So as I said, we've seen that that's already done. So in terms of these IUCN Red List species, ensuring ways that the funding from conservation is going back in, from tourism is going back into conservation. And as you mentioned, so in South Africa, we have, it might be a bit off now, but about 22 national parks, but only about 5 that make money from tourism, but support all the others. And so you need to, this diversification and different models, looking at different things. And as many of you on this webinar will know, that at the IUCN Congress now, the motion 130 on strengthening protected area tourism was passed almost unanimously by members. So there is a real interest in ensuring the sustainability of, tourism in protected areas, so that it does contribute to that conservation rather than, take from it.
Greg?
If I could just compliment Derek and Sue and Ravash. One thing I think that we're seeing, and I will focus specifically on some things that we're looking at in the United States, is there is a significant conflict between the understanding of the outdoor recreation economies in various places and tourism. We're finding in many places where the tourism-based economy is being tracked very unevenly, where in other cases recreation, and I will include in here hunting and fishing as activities, is much better tracked. And I think, and I saw in a question in the Q&A regarding, how we're tracking, and that ministries of tourism and finance need to be involved in this. Let me use again an example from the United States just briefly, because I was involved in this in a prior job when I was president of the American Hiking Society. So we pushed to get the outdoor recreation economy into the Bureau of Economic Analysis for the Department of Commerce. There is now a holding account that registers that, and it's reported out. Tourism does not have an analogous, and yet it's far bigger. There is a really kind of wish-washy approach, if I may say that. And I think that's something we all need to be pushing our governments to do, is to get a better handle on where the benefits, the leakage is, and really what does tourism look like across the broad spectrum.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great. We have another comment that we'd like folks to comment on. Poor environmental engineering design of local community, nature-based tourism tours to buildings and infrastructure does not make it sustainable, ? It is more than having policies, but quality management, operation systems. Don't build it if you can't maintain it. And the respondent asked for you to comment, please.
Ask for who to comment, Kelly?
Ask for our panel to comment on this idea of, really sustainable infrastructure design, community development.
I mean, absolutely. I just, couldn't agree more. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Civilian Conservation Corps, right? I mean, which was, I know 100 years ago, but during a crisis, when America put in place a number of the infrastructure for its, incredible park system. And a lot of care was taken to design the infrastructure and to create the capacity. So in fact, I understand that some of the people who were trained during the Civilian Conservation Corps started construction companies that exist even today. So it's not just a matter of sort of going in and quickly doing something. And the Civilian Conservation Corps also hired historians to design the infrastructure in a way that was compatible with. So when we look at the sector, we have to look at it as this absolute beauty, natural asset that has to be cared for, but in the cultural context. And it is very much possible to do. Thanks.
Thanks, Urvashi. I think we'll go ahead and move on to, we've got a few more questions and we're running out of time. So this is an interesting one. We continue to pluck the feathers off the goose that lays the golden nature tourism eggs. Nice analogy. Is there a playbook for small Caribbean islands, nature tourism, especially when the business model is still short-term risk and high profit? The Caribbean is competing again against the tourism world, as well as fighting low economic development of COVID impacts. Would like to take that. Craig?
Well, I'll certainly share an example that we're seeing real time in a small Caribbean nation. Let me point everyone's attention to Dominica in the Eastern Caribbean. They are at a tremendous crossroads right now because they're building a new international airport. They are looking at what decisions they will make about mass tourism, i.e. cruise, as opposed to arguably one of the most natural islands still protected in at least the Eastern Caribbean. And so there's a real conflict within the population there now of what they should do, whether it's to stay building around their smaller scale operations around natural and of course cultural. They have indigenous populations there as well, or to be going the mass tourism. The building of the international airport, that's going to focus probably more on the mass market a bit, but they have no capacity to do that. So I think one of the things that's so important is for us all to be supporting a broader stakeholder engagement and to really ensure that we get those voices at the table, that it's not a closed door planning process around just investors. And I would use Dominica as an example of that. They are at a crossroads, whether they will be a more nature or sustainably based tourism or fall under the crushing burden, I would say, of mass tourism, which is absolutely not sustainable in such a fragile Caribbean island like that.
Thank you, Greg. I'm afraid I'm going to have to end our session. Thank you so much, panelists, and we look forward to further conversations around these topics into our next session. Thank you, everyone. We're going to take a short break. We'll see you in a couple of minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Terrific. Yeah, we all stayed on time too. That was good.
So Greg, I'm going to drop off now. Thank you very much.
Hey, good care, Derek.
Thank you, Derek.
Yeah, that was terrific. Thanks. I think this is our second panel we've been on in a couple of weeks.
Good luck. Hope it goes
Yeah.
well.
Thank you for agreeing. Join us.
Well, welcome back if you're joining us for this next session, and thank you for joining us today. This is our second session of the day, and this session is called Visitors Count. These are new guidelines that aim to help national stakeholders, protected area managers, and researchers count visitation and measure economic impacts consistently through a standardized approach, something that we've all been yearning for several years now. In this session, several of the guidelines contributing experts will explain how they use this approach and how to help managers make informed decisions on management plans and tourism strategies. This methodological approach, or these approaches, were developed and tested in different protected areas around the world, including national parks, UNESCO World Heritage Properties, and UNESCO Biosphere Reserves. Up first, we'll hear from Dr. Jyoti Hasegar, the Deputy Director of the World Heritage Center at UNESCO. While she couldn't be here today, she pre-recorded a video, which I will now share.
I'm Jyoti Hasegar. I'm the Deputy Director of the World Heritage Center at UNESCO in Paris. It is my great pleasure to be with you today to greet you for this symposium on crisis response and recovery, nature-based tourism, biodiversity, and livelihoods. Unfortunately, I'm not able to join you online today, but it is my pleasure to open this session on visitors count, establishing the economic impacts of tourism in protected areas, and to do so by this video message. I would like to extend our sincere thanks to the organizers, IUCN, Protected Areas Tourism, and Protected Areas Specialist, TAPAS Group, Center for Responsible Travel, CREST or CREST, World Wildlife Fund, WWF, and the Arizona State University, ASU, School of Community Resources and Development. We appreciate the opportunity to participate in this important initiative and thank you for the active role in supporting heritage conservation around the world. UNESCO was pleased to launch the Visitors Count publication at the IUCN World Conservation Congress in September this year, together with the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation. The guidelines are the culmination of many years of research work by a team of international experts from the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas, WCPA, and TAPAS Group. We were also fortunate to have the invaluable support of the European Joint Research Center, BioPAMA project, and the University of Würzburg in Germany and the US National Park Service Social Science Program in developing these guidelines. This publication is a much needed tool to help national stakeholders, protected area managers, and researchers count visitation and measure economic impacts consistently through a standardized approach. Protected areas, including internationally recognized areas such as UNESCO World Heritage Sites, UNESCO Biosphere Reserves, and Ramsar sites, are important elements of national and international conservation policies and actions. They also contribute significantly to the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically Goals 14 and 15. Tourism in protected areas represent one of the economic opportunities that can help achieve the joint objectives of sustainable local livelihoods and biodiversity conservation. In today's societies, an economic perspective of protected areas has grown in importance, and political agendas are increasingly driven by the desire for sustainable long-term growth. Visitors count shows that demonstrating the positive impact of protected areas can lead to greater buy-in and ownership of conservation practices, less poaching and land encroachment, and help offset human-wildlife conflict where it occurs. Once managers understand the number and behavior of visitors they host and the revenues and costs they generate, informed decisions on management plans and tourism strategies can be made. To this end, the guidelines contain methodological guidance across a number of key areas, including consistent visitor counting and surveys, economic analysis, guidance on reporting and communicating results, and protected area tourism management strategies. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown that more than ever, healthy ecosystems and functioning natural systems are key to human well-being. As many protected areas are experiencing increased visitor numbers in recent years, including due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we hope that these guidelines will provide a useful tool for making informed decisions on management planning and sustainable tourism strategies. The guidelines are the newest addition to the tools and projects that UNESCO has available to keep World Heritage properties, to help World Heritage properties develop and manage sustainable tourism. In closing, I would like to thank you all for joining us today and for your interest in Visitors Count. UNESCO looks forward to continuing our work with you to support the conservation of heritage, promoting local sustainable development, and enhancing the visitor experience in protected areas. Thank you very much for your attention. I wish you all a very successful symposium. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. We really appreciate it and wish you were here. Next, we have Dr. Manuel Woltering, the Chair of Geography and Regional Science for the University of Würzburg. Welcome, Manuel.
Yes, welcome everybody. I just want to show my, I don't know. Oh, okay, I can't make my video starting now, but I think you can hear me. That's enough, I think. I'd like to welcome everybody. My name is Manuel Woltering, and I work at the University of Würzburg in Germany as part of a research team focusing on economics of tourism in protected areas. And my following explanations about different aspects of visitor counting were collected, as we heard of before, as part of a bigger volunteer project. And as you can see, oh, why is it not working here? And as you can see, hopefully now many people got involved in this to make it as a success. In particular, I would like to mention Anna Spensley from the TAPAS group, Barbara Engels from the Federal Agency of Nature Conservation in Germany, and last but not least, Jan-Philipp Schägner from the JRC as part of the BioPharma team, who I would like to say thank you very much for their continuous efforts to bring this forward and make, yes, I think a little success story about it. Okay, I would like to start my presentation with this equation for the estimation of the economic contribution of protected area tourism. And all you need to know is, are the shown three variables: visitor numbers, the average visitor spending, and economic multipliers. And this might look quite easy, but it is tricky in detail, as some of you really good know, I think. Besides information about the spending behavior of visitors and economic multipliers, we see the two right variables, and we hear about this more information later in this session. You need to know how many people visit a protected area. Basically, everything starts with the visitation of protected areas. And the number of visitors is the most important variable, as it is the starting point of all analyses, not only of economic impacts, but also of environmental or socioeconomic side effects. And there's a great variation within this variable across sites, ranging from thousands of visits per hectare and year for some tourism hotspots to almost zero in large remote areas. And even you have this distribution within one protected area. Thus, visitor counting programs need to be designed with caution to obtain accurate visitation figures while efficiently using available resources. So, for planning a visitor counting program, you need to keep in mind four essential questions. The first is what to count. And as you can see here, you can differentiate between different things you can count, beginning with entrance, meaning persons who are going to a protected area for any purpose. And this includes also people just driving by, as well as local people passing through a small corner of the park, or daily activities of workers within the protected area. From a tourism point of view, we are interested in visitors. That means persons who visit the protected area just for recreational purposes. And they do visits. And some of you might think, okay, visitor visits, that's the same, but keep in mind that there are some cases in the world where visitors do 2, 3 or more visits within one protected area on one day. And that's why, from an economic perspective, we are interested in visitor days. That means the total number of days that a visitor stays in a protected area, because a visitor can just spend his money once a day and not 2 or 3 times. The second question is how to count. And you see here 3 different ways to do this. The first one is the direct one. And you see here a classical way to do it via paper and pencil, but you can do it also with camera recordings or using observations from the air. The second one is the indirect way. It includes options like counting parking or entrance fees, permits, licenses, as you can see here, entries in guest books, but also signs of use, or in today's times, even social media posts. And the last one is the automatic way. That means counts with mechanical or electronic devices to get an insight in the visitor numbers. Here are just a few examples, like a turnstile or a below ground pedestrian counter here on the left side, or on the right side, a Puro sensor and a wooden stake, as we see here, both the last ones, both at their installing phase. The next question, question 3, is how to sample. So what does this mean? Ideally, every visitor entering the site in a given year is counted. And then the number of visitors counted represents the total annual visitation of a protected area. This is easy to do if entrance tickets are issued at controlled access points, or if automatic counters are operated all year long at every access point. However, directly counting every visitor entering the site may be costly and inefficient, and so counting may take place at certain locations and times, and then used to estimate the number of visits at other times of the year. And this is called sampling. And to do this sampling, you have to ask yourself where to count. At entrance gates, at visitor centers, at remote places. You have to distribute your counting sites to get most or the best information to get the whole visitation of a protected area. But keep in mind not to double count. That's really not what we want, as the same as stated before, because we need just the one visitor can just spend his money once and not twice or three times. Second, sampling, you have to keep in mind the question of when to count, and then how often and for how long a day. We see here an example of 18 counting days, and these 18 counting days were used to make an estimation of the whole year's visitation in one German protected area. And this process is referred to as an upscaling, aggregation, interpolation, or extrapolation process. And depending on how comprehensive and representative the counting is across time and space, the method of upscaling may have a substantial effect on the accuracy of the overall visitation figure. Here now, the 4 questions again you have to keep in mind for your planning a visitor counting program. And every way to count has its advantages and disadvantages. And the option selected will depend on policy needs, available financial resources, labor costs, available staff and expertise within the protected area, the characteristics of the site of interest, and the desired sampling strategy. And as a last slide, I just want you to show this decision tree. You can go through and you can read in the publication we give to you and the material of this conference. And there are 4 steps you have to keep in mind. The first one is essentially you have to explore whether there is data available already that can be used to estimate visitation. If this question is answered with no, then you have to do the next steps. Select your counting locations, select your counting periods, where, when, and how often. And last but not least, select the right counting method. You see in the lower third of the decision tree in the red shaped boxes, the 3 ways I explained. And yeah, if you do this, you can or have the opportunity to get good visitation insights, visitor numbers. And yeah, I hope this was a small insight in what we did about visitor counting within our project the last years. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Manuel, for that excellent presentation. Next, we have Catherine Cullinane Thomas, an economist from the U.S. Geological Survey. Welcome, Catherine.
Hi, everyone. So good to be here. I am working on sharing my screen here. Can you all see it?
You're good.
Yes.
Yes, great. Okay. Great. So good to be with everyone here today. My name is Kathy Cullinane Thomas. I'm going to talk today about how we use visitor surveys to estimate visitor spending. So I'd like to start by thanking the visitor counts team, especially Daniel Metzler, who was an author on this chapter with me, and then the U.S. National Park Service social science program, my colleagues Lynn Kuntz and Matt Fleer. So as Manuel mentioned, basically visitor spending is we're going to multiply the number of people who visited a protected area times a spending pattern to estimate the total visitor spending. And to do this, make this a better estimate, we split visitors into visitor segments. So different types of trips will produce different spending patterns. So this is often based on trip type. So did you come and stay in a hotel, or were you camping, or did you just come on a day trip to the local area? I have an example from Yosemite National Park of visitor segments and spending profiles. So on the left, the pie chart is showing how visits to Yosemite National Park split out by trip type. So about 50% of the visits to the park were people that were lodging outside of the park in hotels outside of the park. And about 11% were people that were staying in hotels that were inside of Yosemite National Park. And then there are about 15% of people that were just in the park on a day trip. And then a variety of different ways that people were camping in and out of the park. And on the right, the bar chart is showing visitor spending patterns for those different types of segments. And you can see they really differ by segment. So people that were staying in lodging spent quite a bit more money per day or night than folks that were on day trips. So this is why we segment visitors. The next important thing is that you need to define what is the area that you are estimating visitor spending for. And so this area could be a small area right around the protected area, or it could be a larger area, such as an entire state or region, or even the whole nation, depending on what it is that you're hoping to understand with visitor spending and the story that you want to be able to tell with knowing those numbers. So here again is our example of Yosemite National Park, which is the red dot there in the state of California. And the area that we include as the local area is just the area right around the park that includes the towns and communities where visitors are staying and spending money. So on our surveys, we ask people specifically to give us information about their spending in that specific area. So these are the questions that we ask on visitor spending or on visitor surveys, specifically to get at visitor spending. I want to point out that in the visitor counts document, there are several example visitor surveys where you can go and look at a whole visitor survey and see exactly how these questions were worded. But specific questions we ask are, how much money was spent in that local area? How large is your group? What type of accommodation are you staying in? So that's how we can segment them. Were you local to that area, or are you visiting from outside of that area? Again, that's going to help us segment visitors. How long did you stay in the protected area and in the area around the protected area? And also, what was your importance of choosing the protected area of the protected area and choosing the destination? And that can help us do some scaling of how much of the visitor spending that we measure can actually really be attributed to the existence of the protected area. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the actual surveys. So we're targeting visitors to the protected area. So we typically do intercept surveys where someone walks up to visitors in the park and asks them, would you be willing to take this survey? And these surveys can be completed in person. So they can do that maybe on a piece of paper or on a tablet right there at the intercept. Or sometimes they're done as mailback surveys where the surveyor will hand the visitors a paper survey and ask them to mail it back after their trip, or some combination of the two. Visitor sampling is an important piece of this. We want to try and get a representative sample of all of the visitors to the park. So choosing where in the park to intercept visitors is one aspect of that. So here again is our Yosemite example, and you can see for the Yosemite sampling design, they were primarily sampling visitors at the major entrances to the park and asking them, would you be willing to take this survey? And then another important piece of getting a representative sample is to think about the timing of your intercepts. So seasonality, you're going to have different mixes of visitors coming, in the high summertime versus the lower winter time, the time of day that you're intercepting people, and the day of the week. Is it a weekday or is it a weekend? I want to point out that when you're doing these visitor surveys, there's a lot of other types of questions you can ask on your visitor survey. So you can combine, use a survey to meet multiple needs. So some of the common other things you might be able to ask on a visitor survey would be questions about trip planning and travel, questions about their time actually in the park, what activities did they do, how did they use the park, how satisfied were they with the park and the facilities. You can ask more about the visitor, their demographics, their group characteristics. And you can also ask about the benefits to the visitor, things like the value of the protected area, so their willingness to pay, questions like that, and also health benefits or perceived health benefits. And then you can also ask any other management relevant questions on the survey, such as questions about crowding or transportation, things like that. That's all I have for you today. Again, I'd like to thank everyone. Really glad to be here with you.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Next, we had scheduled Dr. Thiago Beraldo, the International Technical Advisor for the BioTour, Biodiversity and Tourism Project for the UNDP. He is stuck on a plane, so he has sent us a presentation via video. Please roll the video, Maddie.
Everyone, my name is Thiago Beraldo Souza. I am the Economic Coordinator of the Tourism and Protected Areas Specialist Group, TAPAS. And today I will be speaking about economic analysis of visitation. This presentation is based on our new manual, guideline, Visitors Count, Guidance for Protected Areas on Economic Analysis of Visitation, that we launched with support of UNESCO, BFN, and other partners. So economic analysis is an equation that we need to use 3 variables. We basically count how many visitors we have in a protected area or in a country, in the protected area system of a country, if you are doing this in the national level. Also, we multiply these numbers for the average spending of each visitor, to know how much money they spend in the economy, the direct effect of the visitors' numbers and average spending in the economy. And then we use economic multipliers to measure the effects of this money circulating in the local economy. This is basically what economic analysis does. My previous colleagues, dear and previous colleagues, presented visitors' numbers and average visitor spending. So I'm going to present now economic multipliers. So the first thing to present is the economic effects, how they work. Let's say we have a family visiting a national park. In one of the days of the visit, they decide to go to the town, to the local town, to go to the restaurant. And then they go to the restaurant, they have their meal, they spend their money in the local restaurant. So the money that came from the visitor goes local now through the restaurant, stays in the restaurant local. This is the direct effect, that the money that comes from the tourists and stays in the local economy. However, the owner of the restaurant also need to buy supplies from local markets to offer the meals for the clients. In this situation, we consider the money that comes from the owner of the restaurant to buy supplies, indirect effects. Also, when the money that goes to the market, and then the market uses to buy new supplies, to buy from the local farmers, for example, is also considered in the indirect effects. The money starts to circulate in the economy. One business buy from another business locally, and the circulation of the money is really important because it's not the money that just comes from the tourists, but the multiplication effect that happens in the local economy. Also, we consider the induced effects that are the effects that comes from the money spent from the owner of the restaurant and her, in this case, employees in the local economy. The money that they use to buy food, to put gas on the tank, and so on. So the money that comes from salaries and wages and profits that circulates in the local economy. This are the induced effects. So the total effects that we calculate in those economic analyses are the sum of the direct effects that are ratios that we calculate from total visitors with visitor spending, and also visitor spending with some effects that I will present in the next slide. And then we use the multipliers to calculate indirect effects and induced effects, that when the money circulates in the economy and does this multiplication effect. We have many different ways to present those economic effects, these economic effects, but the most common are direct output and how much are the sales, basically the sales that happens with the money from the tourists spend in the local economy. Income, how much income is generated, how much employment jobs are generated, value added to the local economy or the national economy, the GDP, and also taxes, how much taxes are generated through those economic effects. So to illustrate, I will present a case study where we calculated the economic contribution from 120 national protected areas of Brazil. So this is a national level analysis in 2018. So we have the economic contributions of the protected areas of Brazil. Number of visitors in that year was 12.4 millions. The average spending per visitor was between $10.49 to $60.95 was the average ranged between these two amounts. And the economic multipliers were, in the national level, were between 2.17 and 4.13 to do the calculations. This is important to state that this is in the national level, so multipliers are higher. Normally, multipliers range between 1 and 2 at local level, and also state level. So here we have a normal table that we see in this economic analysis, where we present the direct and total effects of visitor spending at national scale, in this case in Brazil 2018. On the left, we have spending categories, where we use these ones, accommodation, meals, gas and oil, local transportation, activities and guided tours, other expenses, retail sector, and wholesale sector. Because we divide in categories to interview the tourists, the visitors, and also the multipliers are different for different industries when we do this analysis. On the top, we have the effects that represent the results. So we have output in $1 million, jobs generated, personal income, and value added to the Brazilian economy. And on the bottom, we have the results of direct effects, secondary effects that are the indirect and induced effects, and total effects. So just to summarize the impact in Brazilian economy, as output, total effects were about $2.5 billion in sales in Brazil, generating almost 90,000 jobs, just the tourism protected areas in Brazil, in the national protected areas, generating a personal income for owners and employees around $666 million, and a value added to the Brazilian economy of almost $1 billion. These are really important numbers for Brazil, and start to make a difference for stakeholders to understand the importance of the Brazilian economy, the visitation for the Brazilian economy. So the same analysis, with that same analysis, was possible to show that while the protected area agency budget was around $166 million in 2018, and the park protected areas in tri-fee was around $19 million, much less than agency budget, the direct and the total output from visitation was much, and visitor spending was much higher than the agency budget. With this information was possible, protected area management in Brazil could say that for each $1 invested in protected area management was generated $15 for the Brazilian economy. And that information was really important for the protected area agency in Brazil. Thank you very much. I hope you have a brief understanding of what we are talking about economic analysis. In our guideline, you will have much more information in chapter 6 to understand this subject. Thank you very much. And I hope we are having a good presentation.
Thank you, Thiago. We wish you a safe flight. Next, we have Lisa Kajala, the Senior Advisor from Livelihoods. Welcome, Lisa.
Hello. Shall I start?
Yes, please.
All right, just a second. There's a finished scenery, and soon you should see my first slide. There it comes. Hi, everybody. I'm Lisa Kajala, and I work for Livelihoods, Parks and Wildlife Finland, which is a land management agency managing all the state-owned parks and protected areas in Finland. We've been measuring visitor spending effects since year 2010, so for about 10 years now. And I guess this was one of the reasons me and my colleague Joel Erkkonen were invited to contribute to the chapter on reporting and communication in this guidebook. So once the results of economic analysis are available through the steps described in previous excellent presentations, it's essential to report and communicate the results in a clearly understandable way in order to efficiently and effectively reach the target audiences. It's beneficial to harmonize reporting across areas and time when feasible, especially when using a uniform methodology. The chapter of the guidebook on reporting and communication gives ideas and examples on how to do this. Visitor information is important at various levels, from a single protected area to regional and national statistics. It is essential for local protected area managers and for tourism development, as well as for regional, national, and international policy planning, reporting, research, and comparisons. When the economic impacts of protected areas are calculated in a standardized manner, it allows for reporting at all these levels, and moreover, it enables comparisons between areas or regions and across time. On the left here, we have an example of a single visitor survey report from one Finnish national park, and on the right-hand side, you see a graph illustrating the development of local economy impacts of visitors spending at the national level for all Finnish national parks for 8 years from 2010 to year 2018. The contribution estimates can be updated annually, even if visitor survey data are typically not collected from every area every year. as the number of visits is estimated annually. In addition to traditional visitor monitoring reports like printouts and so on, interactive data visualization tools can give users the ability to search for and view specific data. Here's an excellent example of this kind of reporting from the US National Park Service's Visitor Spending Effects webpage, where reports are made available online via an interactive tool. With the help of this tool, users can view year-by-year trend data and explore current year visitor spending, jobs, labor income, value added, and economic output effects by sector, and also for national, state, and local economy levels. Once the reports are ready, it is important to consider the most efficient ways of communicating them to make the case for national conservation. One powerful way of illustrating the importance of visitor spending effects is to compare the economic effects of visitation to protected area budgets, as we saw from Tiago's presentation already. This way, we have been able to illustrate, for instance, in Finland, that public money spent on management and services of national parks and other protected areas comes back manifold to local economies through private businesses and jobs. Finally, for the results to be effective, they should be, of course, communicated to target audiences through appropriate media and communication channels. And if one wants to affect decision-making, timing of the communicating the results is essential. Thank you very much for your attention. Greetings from Finland.
Thank you so much, Lisa. We appreciate your presentation and look forward to a discussion in a few minutes. Lastly, we have John Philip Schegners, a scientific officer from the Joint Research Center. While Philip wasn't able to join us today, he asked if I could share his thoughts. So I'm going to go ahead. Okay, so as we have seen, the visitors count guideline can help with the compatibility and comparability of visitor counts and economic impact results, and handholds users through an economic analysis process, including how to do visitor surveys and visitor counts. The guideline helped protected area managers to understand what visitors spend, the indirect of their spending at local businesses, and induced effects of that spending in the economy. We have been disseminating the guidelines through the IUCN, UNESCO, BIN, and other networks, but recognize there is also a need to provide training and build capacity among protected area practitioners on how to actually use this tool. To supplement this session, we are planning other initiatives as well. We are initiating the development of a massive open online course, or a MOOC, funded by the EU's BioPAMA program. The MOOC will be a training resource that will help protected area managers to measure their economic impacts over time. PowerPoint presentations with accompanying scripts will be developed. These will explain and illustrate each step of the economic analysis clearly so that park managers can follow them. A webinar series will be organized with speakers drawn from among the authors of visitor counts and opportunities for discussions, questions, and clarifications. These webinars will be recorded and will become the core material for the MOOC recordings and will be shared online and accessible to people wanting to take this course. An exam will actually be developed that people can take to test their learning.
Kelly, can you share this in full screen mode, please? It's in the presenter view.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
And Kelly, if you'd like me to share it for you, I can.
Yeah, why don't
absolutely
you
do
go
that too.
ahead? It looks as though with all my screens up, that it might not share properly. Thank you, Maddie. And if you could go down to the next slide, keep going. There we are. Thank you. So the MOOC on visitors count and value chain analysis will complement existing MOOC modules based on the TAPA's group best practices guidelines, which we'll hear a little bit about later. This MOOC has already been done for free by more than 2,000 people from the IUCN's TAPA platform. Next slide, please. Also, the TAPA's group has put in a proposal to organize 2 events at the African Protected Areas Conference in 2022. And this will be a technical workshop and also a panel discussion. We want to use these and share these materials and build capacity among protected area managers, economists, practitioners, and monitoring and evaluation staff and how to use the tool. Last slide, please, Maddie. If you want to find out more about these initiatives and get involved, you can find out more about the TAPA's group through these links or contact me, Kelly Bricker, for more information. Thanks for your patience and your attention to this presentation. Over to you, Greg.
Excellent. Thank you. And I appreciate that very much. We have a number of questions that have come in the Q&A. I wanted to start with the first one, Kelly, and kind of bring it back to you since you just finished up. And I think Maddie and Alex will be bringing all of our other speakers. Here we go. The first question was, who's taking care of the MOOC, if I pronounced that correctly? Who manages that?
I believe it's a consortium of folks, but go ahead, Lisa. Did you have?
Yeah, I don't know whether, Lisa, you want to handle that? And then I have some other questions for our panel.
MOOC, should I know?
Yeah, I can't answer that myself.
Greg, I can say that will be available through our network, the TAPA's group. I don't know who exactly is managing that, but Philip is certainly involved and a number of people on this.
Okay, terrific. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Even though I'm in Europe, I don't know.
No worries. Yeah, I'm not able to answer that. Let me tee up a first question for Manuel that came in. What about qualitative statistics about the visitor's experience? The question is, I believe this would be very useful as the existing quantitative ones are as well. And Manuel, if you would take that first, and then of course I'll open that up to Catherine and Lisa as well. You know, we all deal with both quantitative and qualitative. And so that the question is qualitative statistics, how important and what key ones related to visitors' experience.
Yes, we have to keep in mind the qualitative statistics as well, but I think to make always say it, conclusions about a whole protected area and the economic impact of tourism of a protected area, you need to keep in mind the quantitative dimension, because you want to say something about the whole visitor range coming to a protected area, and this to do just with qualitative and some interviews is not really possible, I think. So yeah, we keep it in mind, and perhaps to make some special analysis, you can use qualitative statistics, but to make an overall conclusion for the whole protected area, I think it's not possible to do it with just qualitative way.
Mhm. Catherine, Lisa, anything you'd like to add to that?
I would add that, as I mentioned, with the visitor surveys, they really can be used to gather, lots of different information as long as you don't make them too long. So there are, I know on the National Park Service surveys, there are some open-ended questions which can, be asked and qualitatively analyzed. So that's certainly a possibility with the visitor surveying to get qualitative information.
Yeah, and I could just
Sure.
add to that a little bit, because I am in a land management agency, and we do both surveys and we gather more qualitative understanding of our visitor experiences as well. And in fact, a very timely question, because we are finding out that we would need, for service design purposes, even more so, qualitative understanding of specific cases. But there are sort of two sides of providing understanding about our visitors and their experiences. So we need systematic visitor monitoring and this kind of, for instance, economic calculations done in a standard manner with a representative sample and with counting combined, to be able to follow the trends, where are we going, and to be able to compare areas and regions between each other. But then qualitative has totally other type of uses in our agency.
Absolutely. Question for Catherine. Catherine, in a park like Yosemite, what percentage of the economy in gateway communities is actually linked to the park?
I can't answer for Yosemite offhand. I will say that, in the U.S. National Park System, there's really a wide variety of parks, and how close they are to city centers or really in rural environments is going to affect very much how much the local area around the park is boosted by the park and the portion it accounts for. So it's really variable from park to park. And certainly in some areas, the presence of the park is a very important and big piece of the surrounding local economy.
Okay, great. Question for all panelists, and you can let me know who would like to address this first. Could you please elaborate on how you take into consideration leakages? Visitor spending that goes directly to import to serve the visitor, for example, non-local food or non-local owners, rather than staying in the community. I don't know who would like to address that first. It's open for anyone.
I can speak to that. So,
Catherine, go ahead.
First of all, so the surveys ask specifically just for local area spending. So we're starting only with spending that occurs in the local area. And then in the United States, the economic model that we use has information on retail margins and also on trade flow information so we're using average trade flow information for the region to estimate the portion of local area spending that is retained within that local area and the portion that is leaked out through imports. So it's part of the economic data that we use.
That's terrific. Manuel or Lisa, would you like to expand on that from your perspectives regarding considering leakage? And
I might mention that, yes, we are using the similar kind of model adopted originally from the US National Park Service methodology. So we are doing our best with leakages with finished data. We don't have the in-plan model or what do you have in the United States these days. So we have a little bit less detailed data, but we still can take into account leakages, certainly, with the same methodology as Kathy just described.
Okay, so there is consistency in the methodology. Do you all feel that it's being adequately addressed with enough robustness that we capture that
Yeah, I think so.
in general? Okay. Yeah. Okay, wonderful. I want to also point out to all participants that there's some interesting and I think very valuable references to some additional information related to qualitative measures. So please go in there. A general question for everyone, and let me go to you first, Manuel. Why is long-term monitoring useful for a protected area? It's a wide open question, but
yes, I think it's useful for a protected area to do this on a long haul because to see changes in the visitation figures and the use of a protected area is one aspect, and the second is to make change or to see the changes within the economic impact of the protected area, because structures can change from day trippers to overnight staying guests, and that has also its effects on the surrounding communities participating or profiting from the protected area tourism. And so I think, to have this in mind, you need to do such analysis from, I think, every 5 or 10 years on to do or to see these changes in visitation habits.
One question I'll ask all of you, and maybe Catherine and Lisa, you can address this. Given the very clear and present danger we're faced with the impacts of climate change, when we look at the kind of monitoring and evaluation that we're trying to do to see economic patterns, et cetera, we're all experiencing significant shifts moving forward in visitor patterns, extended shoulder seasons in protected areas and gateway communities, and projecting out. What have you each done in terms of kind of thinking about this, of how you're maybe modifying methodologies to capture information about visitor trends and spending when things are going to be changing? Ski resorts are not going to have in protected areas, whether it's forests or parks, et cetera, are not necessarily going to have as many days. So what are they going to be doing? Are these shoulder seasons extending, and what are patterns? Catherine, I sense that you probably have some thoughts on that first, and then we'll go to Lisa and Manuel.
This is a question we've been getting asked for sure. And, with regard to the economic impact analysis, we don't have specific methodology at this point, though, as we described, there's the components, the visitor counting, the visitor spending patterns that are combined to estimate visitor spending. And, in the U.S. National Park Service, they are launching a systematic socioeconomic monitoring survey effort that will be surveying parks, a set of parks each year. And in some cases, there will be parks that are surveyed in different seasons. So we've been modifying our visitor spending effects model to be able to use different spending pattern data for different seasons. It's common that we have that detailed information. That is one way that we are able to approach that. And, the park system monitors visitation on a monthly basis and has for a long time. Okay. But as an excellent source of data to be able to look and see how visitation is shifting throughout the year. Their counting data has the trends that can show that over time. So
we have about 1 more minute. Lisa, I'm curious from the Finland perspective. Obviously, climate change is going to have significant impacts on your visitation up there. Any thoughts on this in terms of how you're maybe adapting to that in terms of monitoring?
In terms of monitoring, we have continuous electronic counters, so we can all the time see what's happening, what has happened. The forecasting is then another thing. And I think that's one value of continuous monitoring with similar methodology. We have the long trends, which allow also for doing some forecasting.
Okay, terrific. We're going to need to transition. I want to thank our speakers Manuel, Catherine, and Lisa, and of course, Kelly for facilitating. And unfortunately, we're out of time. And I want to now shift. We'll have about 1 minute to transition over to our third session for this morning's session, Sustainable Livelihoods and Human Health Through Tourism. So I want to introduce Dr. Sue Snyman, our facilitator for our next session. So Sue, you there? Take it away.
Thanks so much, Gregory, and welcome everyone to our third and final session of this first event. I hope that you have had a wonderful time so far and really enjoyed it. There is really an emerging body of evidence that tourism in and around protected areas elevates human well-being, including higher wealth levels, a reduction in poverty, and health benefits. This panel is going to explore the underlying body of research and nature-based tourism models to achieve the best outcomes in this regard. Please do add your questions in the Q&A as you have been doing, and any general comments into the chat. And up first, we're going to hear from Robin Naidu, who is a senior conservation scientist and lead wildlife scientist for the World Wildlife Fund. Take it away, Robin.
Thanks very much, Sue, and good morning, everyone from the west coast of Canada. I'm really pleased to be here to talk to you today about human well-being impacts in protected areas across the developing world. And obviously, you know, the relevance to this session is that, as we know, protected areas are typically, you know, a hub for nature-based tourism around the world. So the academic background to this study was the question that we find in the literature, maybe somewhat surprising to this audience, is, you know, are protected areas good or bad for local people? And, you know, those who cite evidence that it's good suggest reasons like protected areas provide better environmental quality to local people. There's the obvious opportunities from tourism. And for reasons like this, protected areas are good for the people who live nearby. On the other hand, there's a significant body of folks who suggest that protected areas are bad for people who live nearby. And they're bad because they restrict access to resources. They increase human-wildlife conflict. They've historically displaced people. And so for those reasons, protected areas are typically bad for local people. The problem is to make any general insights on this body of work is nearly impossible. And that's because these studies use different methods. They occur in different geographical locations with different socioeconomic contexts. They measure different well-being outcomes at different timescales. And ultimately, recent reviews have concluded that the evidence base is so thin that only 1% to 8% of studies in this body of literature use rigorous methods and data to examine the well-being impacts of PAs, protected areas, on local people. And, you know, of course, this is nonetheless an extremely critical question to answer, particularly in the context of proposed global protected area expansion. So we know that the world just missed its Aichi target that came and went in 2020, but post 2020, we're talking about much more ambitious levels of protection across the world. Many of you will have heard of the 30 by 30 initiative. And so it's really important that we understand what kind of effect this protected area expansion is going to have on other sustainable development goals like poverty alleviation. Is it likely to help poverty alleviation, or is it likely to hinder that goal? So what we wanted to do is really advance this, this field by conducting a quantitative analysis of protected area impacts. And what we wanted to do is generate a consistent database across multiple countries and protected areas, so not restricting ourselves to one particular case study. We wanted to recognize that human well-being depends on many factors, including but not limited to environmental conditions. And we wanted to use rigorous and quantitative methods to assess the impacts of protected areas on local human well-being, while also controlling for many confounding factors. So how did we go about doing this? First, we generated a new comprehensive international database that was based on information from the Demographic and Health Surveys, which is a fantastic program that surveys thousands, tens of thousands of people across the developing world. Rather, all of this data is freely available, and they consist of household surveys that ask really detailed questions on socioeconomic status, livelihoods, health, and so forth. So we harness those data. The great thing about those data is that they're also geo-referenced, so they have a GPS point associated with it. So we extracted environmental information at all of these DHS sampling locations. And then we used a world database on protected areas and calculated the distance of each of those DHS sampling areas to the nearest protected area. And we considered all households within a 10-kilometer distance to be near a protected area, although we tested the sensitivity of our results to that threshold. So this is what the data set looks like in terms of a map. So we can see that although this is not a wall-to-wall complete sort of global data set, it does cover a big part of the tropical developing world. What we're looking at, the blue points represent DHS sampling locations that are further than 10 kilometers from a protected area. The red points represent DHS sampling clusters that are within 10 kilometers, and protected areas are in green polygons. And so again, this isn't wall-to-wall global coverage, but it's certainly a massive data set and includes information on 87,000 children in 60,000 households and over 600 protected areas. So by far the largest quantitative data set that has been brought to bear on this question. So how did we wrangle with this huge amount of data? We took a statistical modeling approach that recognized that households near protected areas are likely to be systematically different than those further away from protected areas. And that's because, as we know, protected areas aren't randomly placed on the landscape, but they tend to be placed in areas that are far from urban centers with low road densities at higher elevation and in less agriculturally productive areas. And all of those things are also likely to influence human well-being and therefore be confounded with any possible protected area impact. So we wanted to control for that. We used a statistical technique called matching. I won't get into the details here, but essentially the concept is that we want to create a control group, much like an experiment. We want to create a control group of people and so compare households that are near protected areas with households that are further away from protected areas, but that are otherwise similar in important respects that might confound our results. And we looked at 4 different well-being outcomes. So this was obviously just a small sample of well-being outcomes, but this is what we had available to us in this data set. So 2 were related to wealth. So a continuous score regarding the household wealth level, and then whether that household could be considered to be in poverty or not based on an international threshold. And then with regard to children, and specifically children under 5, a continuous childhood growth score that's related to height to age, and then whether that child can considered to be stunting, again, based on international thresholds. And of course, stunting is something that's extremely important and has implications that cascade into adulthood, so that go well beyond the current status of a child under the age of 5. And there were specific pathways that we wanted to test. And one of the key ones is related to tourism. And so, we conceptualized that protected areas obviously often have tourism associated with them. That tourism sector can lead to infrastructure springing up around protected areas. So better roads, more health clinics, and both of those can lead to better health outcomes of people who live near those protected areas. And then another pathway is that, as we know, again, the tourism sector at protected areas can often provide jobs to local people in the form of working at lodges or as guides. That additional income can be spent on health outcomes or can be invested in household assets and lead to increased wealth levels. So this was a key pathway related to tourism. It's not the only pathway, so there are other ways in which protected areas can improve human well-being, but I won't dwell on those at the moment. So what did we find? This chart is going to show you the results. On the x-axis, we've got improvement relative to baseline, and by baseline, that includes this comparison group.
Robin.
Thanks. Comparison group of people who are living further away from protected areas, but that are otherwise similar. And what we see in the first instance is that strict protected areas essentially have no effect on people. They're not good for the well-being of local people, but nor are they bad, which is a key result. And then as we go up to these other types of protected areas, we see positive impacts. And if we focus on this type of protected areas, so multiple use protected areas, IUCN categories 5 and 6, that have some tourism, we can see that all of these well-being indicators here are statistically greater than zero, up to 25%, and actually well within the range of other types of interventions and characteristics that are more typically associated with development improvements or improvements in livelihoods. So whether someone lives in an urban area versus rural, whether a mother has breastfed their child, increased gains in education, we can see that with a few exceptions, these effects of living near a protected area are similar to these other types of interventions or characteristics. And so, just to conclude, I think this really provides us with some of the best evidence to date using, a comprehensive, widespread database that not only are protected areas not bad for people, but they can actually provide substantial benefits for people living nearby in terms of health and wealth outcomes. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Robin. Up next, we have Judy Kefagona, who is the Director and Lead Consultant for the Sustainable Travel and Tourism Agenda. Welcome, Judy.
Good evening from Nairobi, Kenya, and thanks for having me today to talk about community conserved areas in East Africa. I'm going to start by giving an overview of the community conserved areas in East Africa, also commonly known as conservancies. Conservancies is an evolving concept in East Africa. I must say, over the last 15 years, we have seen significant evolution of the concept in terms of the models of management, in terms of their approaches, in terms of their financing. And we have also seen a lot of entry of new players in this particular area. Another thing I want us to take note of is that conservancies in East Africa are categorized into three. You've got conservancies, community conservancies that are organized by a community that owns land together. In Kenya, we call this the group ranch model, which means there's a single title to a piece of land and community have decided to set it aside for tourism. Now here, the communal ownership of land is very, very important. We have another type of conservancy where land is privately owned by a number of landowners who live in a particular area, and they pool this land together and say they want to set it aside for conservation, and so they move out and set this land aside for conservation. Then we've got private individuals who have large tracts of land or families, particularly in the Laikipia area of Kenya, where these individuals or families decide that they want to use their land as conservancies. So we already see three key actors in the conservancy model in Kenya. We've got communities where land is communally owned. We've got landowners, because when we come to landowners, there could be landowners who are not members of that community, but they happen to have owned land during the land subdivision process or bought it after subdivision, and therefore they are landowners. So we have conservancies by landowners. We have conservancies by communities that are in indigenous, homogeneous communities. And then we have conservancies in Kenya that are private owned. So when we talk about communities and conservancies and well-being of and livelihoods of the communities, we have to look at them in those different angles. So if I start by looking at the perspectives around the whole model, we know that the conservancy model has many different actors around it. The key actors are normally the landowners, the communities, or the individuals who have set their land aside. But then we have government, who is the developer of policy, and then we have tourism investors. Why? Because one characteristic of community conservancies is that most of them are dependent on safari tourism, which means they depend on the daily rate that is paid at the gates by tourists who come to visit the conservation areas for purposes of tourism to earn revenue. So the revenue, there's a singular source of revenue that is earned directly out of this model. Now, if you look at all these actors, they all have a different way of interpreting what a conservancy is. If you ask a community member or a community landowner what a conservancy is, and this is based on a study that we did in 2018 out of the 3 most established conservancies in Masai Mara. And for the landowners and the community members, the conservancy was a land management model that is dependent on tourism because of the high biodiversity to bring revenue to the community. So land management is most important for the community member. If you look at a lot of literature, and if you look at the Wildlife Management and Coordination Act in Kenya, for example, it defines the conservancy as a conservation model. It looks at the conservancy as another conservation model aside from the national park that is state protected. So they see a conservation model where the community are the leaders. So it is a community-led a conservation model that uses tourism as a vehicle to generate revenue. And therefore it finds its way into the Tourism Act as well, because now it is seen as a destination. Communities don't see their conservancies as a destination. They see it more as a land management model that helps them to retain their land so that they can continue their traditional model practice livelihood of pastoralism, because these models allow access at different times of the year for pastoralism purposes. Then we have the tourism investors, who are big players in the conservancy movement or the model. The tourism players, when they look at the conservancy, they see a sustainable tourism development model. And in this sustainable tourism development model, they see themselves as operators who are supporting the sustainable development of tourism. If you look at the reports of tourism companies that operate in conservation areas, they will always refer to the conservancies as their contribution to sustainable development of tourism. They will be saying that by the virtue of the fact that we operate in these areas, we are supporting sustainable development of tourism. Now, these interpretations, these varying interpretations of conservancies in East Africa, because we also did a few conservancies in Tanzania, where it is totally different. There is heavy government engagement, even in what they're calling the community conserved areas. But we found out that this thinking, these 3 different levels of thinking was the same even in Tanzania. That's how the communities perceived the conservancies, how the tourism businesses perceived it, and how the policymakers and the conservation world perceived it was so different. Then we also have another group that has a perception of what the conservancy is. And this is what I call the social justice tourism group. These people who are the group that wants to see better tourism, that talks about ecotourism. So when they see, when this group looks at a conservancy, they see a tourism model, a tourism and conservation model that has the potential to be inclusive and to benefit host communities. And that is also a different perspective about conservancies. Now, what is the impact of these different perspectives on the conservancies? The impact of this different perspective on the conservancies. Thank you. The impact is that the conservancies are facing many vulnerabilities. And as I'm concluding, I'll just mention one. From the community's perspective, it means that the next generation of the children of the current landowners, their interpretation of land management, of the Conservancy being a land management model, has given them a chance to sell that land. They're seeing the value of the land and they want to sell it because it has gotten higher value out of protection. So the highest risk to the conservancies in East Africa today is the perception that this is a land management model, and therefore as the land increases value, you can take it to the market. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judy. We are going to cross the ocean now from Kenya and head to Arizona, where we have our next speaker, Dr. Kelly Bricker, who is the professor and director of Hainan ASU Joint Tourism College at Arizona State University. Welcome, Kelly.
Thank you so much, Sue. Pleasure to be here. And I'm going to share some thoughts on benefit sharing related to parks and protected areas, specifically on tourism. And this work comes out of a special issue that Sue and I did a couple of years ago. Next slide, please, Maddie. What we have learned from protected areas sustainable tourism is that over many years, it is significantly has the potential to not only intersect as a tool for conservation, but really is part of this larger system. It's people, it's places of each destination or region, and really part of a political and institutional framework where people offer amazing experiences for visitors and sometimes residents alike. The pandemic, however, is dramatically changing all of this and has caused a systemic shock with widespread implications. Protected areas are part of this socio-ecological system, and as such, communities living in and around protected areas are impacted. And when evaluating the relationship between a healthy planet and sustaining healthy people, communities, nations, and the intricacy of this vast web of interrelationships really becomes clear. Think of global climate change as an example. Next slide, please. Individual human beings can deliver health benefits to the planet, while a healthier planet can reciprocate through several ecosystem services, a few of which are shown here. These services fill not only fundamental biological needs, but also cultural and recreational, aesthetic, and spiritual well-being needs. People depend on the planet for medicines that originate from diverse types of ecosystems. And healthy ecosystems also help us understand disease, support the food web on which people depend, and reduce the risk of contracting infectious diseases. Next slide, please. For the purposes of this presentation, benefit sharing is defined as a commitment to channel some returns, whether monetary or non-monetary, back to the range of designated participants, affected communities, or source nations. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. These benefits can include both tangible and intangible benefits, ranging from direct financial benefits from protected areas to the ability to use natural resources within protected areas to ecosystem services resulting from the conservation of these protected areas. Next slide, please. Yet many of these benefits are difficult to measure and are often even more challenging to communicate to those living in and around a protected area. Next slide. And as research has shown, that even the communication and measure of tangible financial benefits from, for example, tourism in protected areas is on sometimes an ad hoc basis, with many governments being unaware of the total contribution of their economies. Next slide. While some communities engaged in protected area tourism, especially here in the United States, often referred to as gateway or amenity communities, might secure financial benefits from outdoor tourism and recreation industries, benefits may also be severely decreased due to overcrowding, air pollution, water scarcity, or unplanned development, just to name a few. Next slide. Next slide. And equally disconcerting are communities significantly dependent upon protected area international tourism dollars may find their economies in collapse, as we've heard about, due to their significant dependence on protected area tourism. There's no doubt we have witnessed these varying challenges throughout the last couple of years. Next slide, please. While the number and size of protected areas has been increasing, the funding that is available to manage them has remained generally stagnant, and in many cases has declined, resulting in significant shortfalls and insufficient means to ensure effective achievement of conservation and livelihood goals. And the pandemic, once again, has exacerbated this situation. Funding shortfalls have highlighted a potential challenge for protected areas in terms of benefit sharing, especially with local communities. If protected areas are unable to fund necessary operational expenses, how will they then share benefits, particularly financial benefits, with those living on the edge? To ensure protected areas are effectively managed through appropriate levels of funding, innovative and creative mechanisms to support funding are really needed. While we have seen protected area tourism, if well managed, contribute to this shortfall somewhat, we have all seen that some level of insurance support is needed during times of crisis, such as COVID-19. Next slide, please. Benefit sharing from protected area asks us to ensure equity in thinking about the long-term benefits of protected area tourism. This likely involves intense consideration of governance, which includes decision-making and power structures, relationships, and accountability. Next slide, please. And equally critical is an understanding of the local community dynamics, hierarchies, and power sharing, which are essential to ensure the most marginalized, most impoverished are included in benefit sharing mechanisms within communities. Therefore, for stakeholders, consultation, joint decision-making, and advocacy are all necessary for equity to be realized. Next slide, please. And beyond the most notable economic and employment direct benefits of protected area tourism, we also know that successful benefit sharing programs include ongoing training, education, and other forms of capacity building that are designed around the needs of the community. Whereas lack of such empowerment and engagement may actually impede ways in which benefit sharing can address localized changes. Next slide, please. Increasingly, next slide, please. Increasingly evident is that well-structured partnerships, agreements, and governance structures with transparent benefit sharing processes provides opportunities for communities to connect to economic benefits and employment opportunities. While there are vast differences in these types of agreements, common to all must be a transparent structure of engagement and procedures for fair distribution of these opportunities. Next slide, please. Understanding particularly community needs is also essential to understand the benefit sharing mechanisms or processes. And while economic benefits have been shown as critical, there are multiple ways in which these benefits may be fulfilled. As a framework for understanding complex systems, researchers have suggested both tangible revenue, economic returns, infrastructure, health, and ecological, as well as intangible aspects of communities, such as empowerment, psychological, social, and political, and that these are considered and influence the effectiveness of benefit sharing in tourism development. With such an emphasis on revenue generation, poverty alleviation, next slide please, and various forms of capacity building, benefit sharing is a complex interaction which deserves increased attention. For example, consider the opportunity for significant innovation at policy level, which in turn may have significant implications at the community level. Next slide, please. Governments could consider tax incentives and support for schemes for tourism enterprises that demonstrate increased benefit sharing structures and programs, and for those tourism enterprises that contribute to the protection of biodiversity and build capacity in communities living on the edge of protected areas, incentive programs, tax or otherwise, could be implemented. Adaptive co-management of protected areas may be a way to address the intractable challenges facing protected areas and sustainable tourism, such as conflict, complexity, and uncertainty. With co-management structures, there may be increased opportunities for local empowerment and innovation, positive perceptions of engagement, perceived control, and sustainable behaviors. While specific research on co-management of tourism in protected areas is really sparse, there is some indication of positive benefits because of a level of participation by communities, including equitable benefit distribution and relatively high levels of communication. So recently, in thinking of ways to ensure resilience in times of crisis, such as COVID, Ayers and Launer have suggested novel funding opportunities that could benefit communities and protected areas in crisis, such as diversifying income streams, reducing sole reliance on protected area tourism, implementing novel funding opportunities such as 401ks for nature, endowments or emergency funds, or something like a COVID tourism tax. In addition,
1 minute, Kelly.
Thank you. In addition, we have seen some destinations, next slide, please, take advantage of opportunities to bolster regional tourism, virtual tourism, as well as using skill sets of tourism operators for community good, such as rural vaccination programs and emergency management services. Next slide, please. Research and programs have taught us that active institutional structures and support, the establishment of good governance policies and practices, and clear benefit distribution plans, community engagement, empowerment, all play a role in addressing the challenges and promoting a more positive and sustainable benefit sharing model. Thank you. Next slide, please. Very much.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Up next, we have Teresa Pastor, who is the Project Development and ECST Manager from Europark. Welcome, Teresa, over to you.
Good evening, can you hear me? And can you see my screen?
We can, thank you, Teresa.
Okay, so good evening from Barcelona. I'm working for the Europark Federation, which is the largest association of protected areas in Europe. And I'm going to introduce briefly the capacity building program that we have to maximize benefits from tourism in parks. So Europark, we have a management tool to manage sustainable tourism. We have been very successful already for over 20 years. And the key part of this management tool is working in partnership. To do that, it is needed the creation of a sustainable tourism forum in which all relevant stakeholders are involved, that is communities, the authorities, and also the tourist business. They work together in order to produce a common sustainable tourism strategy and action plan. Of course, working, involving different type of people is not an easy task. You need to have very good communication and negotiation skills. This is why from Europark, we organized a first online course on communication and stakeholders involvement. Sorry, don't know how to pass the. Sorry for that, because I don't know what's going on. But
if you click on the slide, Teresa, just on.
Oh yes, here. Okay,
yeah.
Now okay. So in this course, which is online course based on the Moodle platform, it's part of a European project. we specified the different parts of a communication strategy, putting a lot of attention on how to identify, understand, and communicate with the stakeholders. Of course, we also talk about objectives and channels and tools and implementation of the communication strategy and how to evaluate it. In this course, we also provide personal communication competencies, which are at the core of a good communication, with competencies such as active listening and effective questioning, universal emotions and nonverbal communication, and negotiation and conflict resolution. Also, we have delivered another online course to help managers to implement the action and strategy for tourism sustainable in their parks. This course is also delivered in the Moodle platform. It's part of another European project, the Sustainable Tourism Training for Tomorrow project. It's a free course, which is available in English, French, Spanish, and Italian. And it's composed of 9 different modules, which focus on all the different important tasks and actions that such a plan should include. The first module focus on landscape and biodiversity heritage. The second one focus on conservation through tourism, with such actions such as encouraging tourists to deliver donations, for example, or to engage in voluntary activities. The third module focus on reducing impacts, with reducing the carbon footprint, pollution. The fourth module focus on accessibility and facilities, with a special focus with people with special needs. The fifth module focus on effective visitor communication, so how to communicate the park to visitors. The sixth module focus on social cohesion. The seventh module focus on ensuring prosperity to the local communities. The eighth module focus on monitoring the impact of tourism. And the ninth module focus on communication and shelter engagement. All these modules can be followed independently, one from another one. And at the end of each module, there's a quiz. And if successfully passed, you can get a certificate. If you are interested in following this course, you just type in your browser, Sustainable Tourism Training for Tomorrow, and you will be directed to it. Finally, we are also working on the production of a pedagogical toolkit addressed to sport trainers. The object is to provide the trainers who are going to train visitors and tourists in the outdoors recreation, outdoor sports, to provide them with pedagogical tools in order to introduce sustainability and to minimize the impact that these outdoor sports may have in protected areas and in nature in general. So we have already identified for individual sports, mountain sports such as hiking, orienteering, mountain biking, water sports such as kayaking or sailing, and winter sports such as snow skiing. So we have already identified the main impacts these sports exert in the protected areas, such as disturbance to wildlife, overcrowding, littering, and now we are in the process of developing this pedagogical tool with educational elements that can be done on the field. Of course, continuous improvement is key to have to deliver a sustainable destination. So this is why we need to adapt to the new times, to the new situation, and now we are living special times, of course, with not only because of the pandemic, but also because of the climate and biodiversity crisis. So we have new situations. We need new capacities to be built on. So at least in Europe, we have detected, or we have had a high increase of visitors in protected areas, but with especially with a new profile of visitors. So we are getting more local and domestic tourists, more families with children. Has been an increase of the use of private car, and many of these newcomers are not so familiar with park regulations. So managers that are dealing with the promotion of tourism, sustainable tourism in their parks need to improve other skills to get new capacities. So from Europark, we will like to work now on providing capacities on the promotion of creative and innovative thinking, so to be ready to find new solutions to all these new situations, to know better the different type of visitors and their real needs. It's not the same family that experienced hiker. To manage large influx of visitors, specifically in specific parts of parks. To have a sustainable mindset, to introduce sustainability in all aspects, in all services provided by the park, to provide effective communication and to use real-time technologies that are currently available. And of course, to cooperate and work in partnership, because this is key to deliver sustainable destinations.
Teresa, 1 minute.
Yeah, so as I said, continuous improvement is key for sustainability. And this is what Europark helps managers to do by providing networking opportunities, by organizing exchanges, by organizing webinars, by organizing this kind of capacity building tools that I have just presented to you. And I leave here my contact name and my email address. If someone wants to further inquiries, please write to me. And I invite you to visit our website, where you will find all these tools. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa, Kelly, Judy, and Robin, for your wonderful observations on this intersection between protected areas, tourism, and livelihoods. We have a number of great questions, and so we'll dive right into them. Our first question is to Robin. Is there a critical size or relationship with the size of protected areas to have a substantive influence on local economies and households? A good example is the small island developed states in the Eastern Caribbean, where the protected areas may only be 10 hectares. Robin?
Yeah, thanks, Jim, and thanks for that question. And I guess the two answers. The short answer is we didn't examine that specifically in our study, even though we could have. So, we do have information on the size of protected areas, but we didn't explicitly consider that in our well-being simulation. So I can't say anything quantitative from our results on that front. I guess speculating, I could imagine that smaller protected areas, could provide those benefits because, from a tourism point of view, I guess, the benefits are a function of, where the specific job opportunities and infrastructure associated with tourism might arise. And in a smaller protected area, that's likely to be more focused. And so there's less chance that, in a larger protected area where you've got those kind of things spread out and diffuse, and they simply may not coincide with where people are living. So, but that is pure speculation, and we didn't examine specifically the size implications of protected areas in terms of our well-being impacts.
And relatedly, another individual asked the question, is there a minimum sample size in terms of the population surveyed?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, we use these existing demographic and health surveys for our work. So we didn't go out ourselves and and sort of conduct these studies. And if we had, we might have done it differently. But of course, it's extremely difficult to do that across 34 countries and all of these different protected areas. So, I think it does bring up the point. I saw that question was also asking about the sort of temporal nature, the sort of the influence of time. And that's something that our study didn't deal with, but I think it would be great to do this in particular locations. So to really track well-being outcomes over time so that we can see how, positive, potential positive impacts of protected areas sort of cascade through time from park establishment and going forward. So we weren't able to do that in our study, but I think it would be very useful to do that in particular places.
And we have a question, actually, there are two questions, and this is for Judy. For the conservancies, there are obviously different models in terms of who puts up the upfront capital and revenue sharing and the management of those of the tourism properties and experiences. In your experience, which of the different models do you believe are the most successful, not only in the good times, but in the not so good times, such as we're experiencing right now?
And unfortunately, my internet just dropped when you were asking me the question.
Oh.
And so I only got the last bit of the question.
Okay.
I hope it is enough now. It
Okay.
is back.
Okay, very, very quickly. There are a number of different conservancy models in terms of who puts up the upfront capital, who manages the tourism properties and experiences. And which model, I mean, from your perspective, which models do you feel are the most successful, not only in the good times or the bad times, in terms of benefiting communities?
I think, like I mentioned, that the conservancy models are evolving. What we have learned from Kenya is that different models work for different places. And like I mentioned at the end of my presentation, the land management model is very, very important for the success of any conservancy in Kenya. If the land is not secure and protected, it doesn't matter what else you have, because then that land is vulnerable. It can change uses at any given time, and it can change owners at any given time. So the only constant that makes a conservancy successful in East Africa today is that the land has got to be secured. Today, the land in conservancies is secured using ordinary land management security, which means you register the title and put a caveat in the title that this land is now under protection and it can't be sold. From our experiences in conservancies in Masai Mara, you can still go to court and say that I now want to use this land. I have much need for it than conservation. And the law can actually, the courts can actually grant you alternative use for that particular land. So the only constant for success in the conservancy model today is the protection of the land. Without that, it doesn't matter which kind of tourism business is there, how responsible they are, how committed the community is, how much donor funding has been pumped in, that will not save the land if the land protection model is not the right one.
Right. Follow-up. In terms of the financial and health and education benefits and revenue sharing from the tourism income revenues that, let's say, that occur on the land, which are the models do you think yield the best benefits for the people?
Jim, was that question for me?
No, that was for Judy. For Judy
Right.
again, the follow-up question.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. I thought that was for
Sorry.
Yeah. In terms of benefits for the community, if we are talking about, I'm trying to avoid the use of the term best model because we are going through an evolution. And at any given time, 15 years ago, there was a best model where land was set aside landowners were paid a fixed monthly income, and the land was then registered and protected. 15 years later, we are seeing quite a mix of that, where landowners now want to be investors. They don't just want to be paid for setting aside their land. They now want to earn equity. They're like, okay, what is the value of this conservancy? What is the equity? If it's going to be an equitable model, we don't want to be paid some fixed rate for the parcels of land that we have put in. We now want to understand the entire value of the land plus the biodiversity in it and its accrued value over time, and we want a share of it. And they're now talking about, do we get 75% share and the investors get 25%? These are discussions that are now emerging in 2021, especially after the COVID crisis, that actually showed that the conservancy models were so vulnerable because by May 2020, landowners were on 50%, well, actually they were on zero for 3 months, and then it went to 50% of the rate that they were receiving because donors quickly came in and supplemented their conservancy income. Without donor funding, the landowners in the current model would have been at zero income for the entire of 2020 and 2021, which has been heavily supplemented by donor funding. Now, that kind of funding is not sustainable for the conservancies today. A different innovative financing model has to be found. And that is why now the questions of equity are being discussed so that conservancies can have reserves. The model that we have today does not allow for conservancies to have reserve. So we've had a lot of learning models. We don't have best models. We've got working models. And all of them, whether it comes to benefit sharing with communities, whether it comes to, we're talking about access to financial finances from different sources, whether we're talking about biodiversity protection, all these models are emerging. And every other 5 years, I have seen significant changes, right from mindsets of landowners, what they were when we first saw the first conservancy in Masai Mara 20 years ago. That landowner is not the same landowner today. They're thinking very differently. They're asking very different questions than they asked 15 years ago. And so what was great for them in 2006, it's not as valuable today. And that is why they're talking more and more of equity, and they're talking about shareholding today. They want to be shareholders in the businesses. They want to own the businesses and have operators come in and operate on management leases. They are thinking, and it is also because the first generation that signed leases for conservancies in Kenya is different. Somebody who was 20 years when their parents signed into the conservancy is now 45, and they're the ones in charge, and they have gone to school, and they're telling their parents, no, we can't continue like this. We have to have different value. We have to start thinking about this land very differently. It's no longer agricultural land. It is now economic. It is land with economic value. It is no longer pastoralist land that is looked at in terms of how much cattle it would hold and how much maize will be grown on it as an alternative, because that was the basis of calculating what the landowners get. The 45-year-old who was 20 years then is saying to everybody, including the donors, that we are thinking differently about this land. They are calculating carbon and saying, what will be the equivalent? What about if we left it aside and there was no tourism and we just used them as carbon sinks? What will be the value that we will get out of it? Is tourism giving us good value for money? For the first time, landowners are questioning the value of tourism. In 2006, it seemed like it was the only vehicle that will be used by conservancy. Today, they are questioning the value of tourism. They're asking, are there alternatives to tourism that can bring value to this land?
Thank you, Judy. And for the rest of the panelists, this brings up the questions during the pandemic. Many individuals and organizations have asked the question, should we be investing more in other, or diversifying other activities in and around protected areas to diversify revenue streams other than tourism? So I will open up the floor to any of you to give your thoughts on that question.
I'm happy to jump in for a second. I absolutely believe that diversity, we know biodiversity is critical for a healthy planet, and I think economic diversity is critical for a healthy community. And that diversity could come, our example in Fiji is when tourism totally stopped, farmers were able to go back to their fields and still provide not only subsistence, but commercial value agriculture to their communities during a pandemic. The skill sets that are used, I think, are really important. They can be transferred to reaching rural communities for vaccination programs. So I think diversity and thinking about the skill sets and the capacity that's being built within a community is really important.
Okay. One final question for any of you. I mean, historically, government aid organizations, international finance institutions, foundations have really not comprehended fully the connection between protected areas, tourism, and livelihoods. Do any of you have any thoughts in terms of how to build the best case to prompt these organizations to invest more in what I like to call conservation travel or conservation tourism and its benefits to livelihoods?
I can just offer my quick perspective, Jim. And, I think I alluded to this in my talk that, the literature to date has largely been composed of case studies in particular places. So, you can see some benefits happening over here with Kenyan conservancies, but those might be different than Namibian conservancies, and these, all of those things will operate differently than in Fiji, where Kelly was mentioning, or in Europe, where Teresa was talking about it. And then it becomes a situation where everyone can kind of pick something from somewhere and say, well, this is what's happening. And it's very difficult to sort of generalize about these impacts. And so, I think the case studies are critically important because they kind of flesh out, things in any one particular area that is difficult to do with a sort of more generalized average type of effect, like the study I talked about mentioned. But I do think it is important to talk about those average effects using the best available data, because that does provide sort of some more general guidance to policymakers and funders. So I guess those are my quick thoughts.
It does seem, if we couched, all of these issues, which are really being pinpointed in today's crisis, right? Health and well-being, really contribution to the SDGs, thinking about on a broader scale the health and well-being benefits, that does seem to resonate with lawmakers and institutions, and sort of heading towards that goal of sustainable development in all facets that are demonstrated by the SDGs.
Just to add on that, I think when we get to a point where conservancies can have the voice to speak on and present their needs, then probably the approach to funding is going to change, because then conservancies will be presenting their understanding of the value of the conservancy. Today, like I mentioned earlier on, the different interpretations of the conservancy are interest interpretations. Everybody is interpreting the conservancy based on their interests, and that interest will drive how they engage with the conservancy, and it has also affected how conservancies receive their funding from many different organizations. Now, unfortunately, much of this funding in Eastern Africa is what I call very opportunistic. It is opportunistic in the way, in this way. It is opportunistic because the funding addresses an interest of the funder most of the time. This is what we like. The Conservancy has these 10 problems. We know that problem number 10 is the one that will kill or the Conservancy, or it's dependent, the life of the Conservancy is dependent on it. But because we want to address problem number 3, we will still put our money in problem number 3 and ignore problem number 10. So it's very opportunistic, and that is why it is not helping the conservancies. And that's why nobody wants to talk. All these funders don't want to talk to each other, because everybody has an interest that they want to protect. And the conservancies are not yet strong enough to come out to say that, you know what, if you want to talk to us, we are now addressing SDG number 5, and that is where all our funding is going to.
Well, thank you all. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, and I want to thank you for your very excellent observations on this challenging topic, not only the challenges, but also the opportunities that lie ahead. This will bring us to a close for our first session, and then we will all return back in about 6 hours from now for another group of individuals and sessions that are completely different from this, from the first session on, and it will be visitation and biodiversity conservation in protected areas and how COVID has impacted those areas. The impact of the return of tourism, especially in those areas where COVID vaccinations have accelerated, and the over-tourism issues associated with that. And then lastly, sustainable tourism blueprints and solutions. So we want to thank you and hope you were inspired by today's first session, and we hope to see you back for the second. Thank you very much.